A utility is a company that provides essential services, such as electricity, to the public and is regulated by the government. Whether owned by the public, a co-op, or private investors, such companies are often granted a monopoly because they operate infrastructure that is impractical to duplicate, but this monopoly is subject to strict government oversight to ensure fair prices and adequate service. Railroads are as critical to our society as electric power. They provide vast and efficient arteries that feed and fuel our communities and the economy. There are certain commodities that can only move by train. Coal and wheat, for instance, have no choice really but to ship by rail. Most other commodities can be moved by truck, but trucks have disproportionate negative impacts on public health, the infrastructure, vehicle safety, congestion, and the environment. The public has an interest in striking a balance between the use of modes of transportation. For most of their history, U.S. railroads have been treated as something akin to investor-owned utilities, regulated to fulfill their public purpose while sustaining the revenue necessary to keep them afloat. Fighting Bob La Follette, a renowned politician of the Progressive era, was a young congressman for Wisconsin in 1887 when the Interstate Commerce Act was passed. A champion of regulatory structures his entire career, wary of the concentration of economic power, he laid out three principal purposes for regulation. First, to prevent unjust and unreasonable rates. Second, to prevent discrimination. And third, to enforce and regulate adequate service. As the Progressive Party candidate for president in 1924, even amidst the anti-Bolshevism of the first Red Scare, Fighting Bob championed the public ownership of both the electric power infrastructure and the railroads. The balance between private profit and the provision of service that is needed by a society has been and remains the dominant theme in our country's relationship to railroads. Where other countries own the infrastructure, and in some cases the trains themselves, the U.S. has only flirted with public ownership, and primarily in times of crisis when the country either needed more from the railroads than they were able to provide, or when their concentrated economic power was growing at the expense of farmers and workers, or when regulation itself failed to account for the competition from trucks and railroads became unattractive to private capital. In this episode, we'll walk through this history together in ways that complement previous episodes, but dig into the regulatory history of U.S. railroads and how the forces of public purpose and private profit battled for dominance. We'll explore how the regulatory system was established, how it matured, succeeded, and sometimes failed, and why, as neoliberal ideas of deregulation and globalization took hold in the 1970s, deregulation of the railroads won out over public ownership, even as the public was taking on the risks and liabilities that private capital was unwilling to bear. All this will provide an excellent foundation for understanding what has happened since and the railroad and regulatory systems we have today, and why at this moment, when the largest railroad merger in U.S. history is being proposed, so many are warning that further consolidation is merely kicking the can down the road for an industry and infrastructure that has been allowed to abandon its public purpose in order to serve its Wall Street masters. I'm Bill Moyer, and this is Reconnect America, a podcast about how rail transport and the corridors trains operate on offer potential solutions to some of the most vexing problems of our time.
There was this new technology. Nobody could compete in American life without having access to this infrastructure.
The Alliance said everyone depends on the railroads. These are in effect public utilities, therefore they should belong to the people.
Inequality is getting worse, this concentrated money power, and people are freaking out because not just that farmers can't make a living, but it threatens democracy.
What would get a railroad into trouble more quickly than anything else when it came to filing rates is if that rate placed one class of shippers or one set of communities at a comparative disadvantage relative to another.
This system was in place during the Great American Takeoff that created the world's largest middle class, incredible industrial base that won World War II.
It was never set up to protect the railroads and other forms of transportation.
The interstate highway system was draining freight traffic from the railroads at government expense.
The railroads continue to be strenuously regulated under the presumption that they have this monopoly power that they actually increasingly don't have.
Deregulation rescued the railroad corporations and destroyed rail transportation.
The fact that they passed through 400 small towns between Chicago and Seattle has become irrelevant to that.
If you're somebody like me who lives in the Rust Belt, you see what's been left behind. My area is latticed with abandoned rails.
Both sides do share a vision of wanting a reindustrialization, and you can't get reindustrialization without fixing the railroad problem.
To start, let's get back to the very beginning, when railroads had completely reshaped the American economy.
There was this new technology. Nobody could compete in American life without having access to this infrastructure.
That's Phil Longman, senior editor at Washington Monthly and policy director at the Open Markets Institute.
Before long, that infrastructure came to be controlled by a handful of plutocrats, and they engaged in active discrimination against different peoples, classes of peoples, regions, industries, in order to maximize profits. And that soon became intolerable to Americans in the late 19th century, where it was really a total threat to the whole concept of free enterprise, because under the emerging unregulated railroad system, it didn't matter that you invented a better mousetrap. That's not what determined who succeeded and who didn't in business. What mattered is who could get the better deal with the railroad.
As it turned out, it was mostly customers in large cities with multiple competing railroads who could get a better deal, which made farmers in remote areas pretty unhappy.
What they were in particular upset about was something called long-haul, short-haul discrimination.
That's Albert Chirella, professor of history at Kennesaw State University.
A railroad company would often charge far more on a cent or dollar per mile basis for a very, very short distance between some small town and the main line than they would charge on the main line to East Chicago. The reason, of course, was that on the short haul, there was no competition. The railroad had a monopoly. On the long haul, there was competition.
And here was another problem. Because that competition for mainline traffic had a tendency to get out of control. In order to prevent their competitor from getting the upper hand, railroads had built tracks parallel to each other all over the country, and especially between large cities. But as Phil explains, railroad infrastructure is incredibly expensive to build and maintain.
If you're going to build a railroad, you got this huge cost of acquiring the land, to laying the track, to getting the rolling stock, huge fixed costs.
Those high upfront costs mean that once a railroad has entered a market, there is a strong incentive to remain.
If you're in a business that has those big fixed costs, which means you got to pay them no matter what the volume of business is, then you're very tempted to sell below cost when things go wrong, because you may be losing money when you sell below cost, but you're losing less money than if you just turned the business away.
And this temptation to sell below cost is especially strong when a railroad has to compete with other railroads.
Where they faced competition, they would get into these price wars with each other and just go into a race to the bottom.
These price wars drove down rates for long hauls on main lines where railroads had competition. This meant that some places got very inexpensive rail service. But as Professor Chirella points out, that created a loss of revenue for railroads, which meant they had to compensate by continuing to charge monopoly rates on their branch lines.
The only way they can remain in business, i.e. not go bankrupt and suspend operations, is to cross-subsidize by charging far more on the short haul than the long haul.
Shippers who got the short end of the stick on this practice were understandably furious about it. And they were furious not just because the railroads were exploiting their need for transportation, but because, in so doing, the railroads were undermining a widely held vision of what America was all about.
That founding generation, they were all about economic independence. Their vision of how this democracy was going to work is we're all going to be independent producers, yeoman farmers, beholden to nobody. And under their theory of democracy, if the man owns everything, democracy won't work because people won't feel free to vote for the right guy. They'll just vote for whoever Elon Musk tells them to vote for or whatever. So that is very much informing American politics in the 1870s and 1880s.
The first movement to coalesce in opposition to the railroad's practices came from the Grange, and the Grange succeeded in getting laws passed in many states to regulate railroad rates. These were called Granger laws. But out of that ferment emerged the Farmers' Alliance, a populist movement which took things even a step further. The Alliance didn't want the public to just regulate the railroads, they wanted it to own them.
The Alliance said everyone depends on the railroads and the telegraph. These are in effect public utilities, therefore they should belong to the people.
Obviously, railroad companies were never going to be cool with public ownership. But they also hated the patchwork system of state-by-state regulations that Granger laws had created, and they were cannibalizing themselves with ruinous competition. In the 1870s, railroads had attempted to manage that competition and ward off Granger laws by trying to self-regulate.
Railroads formed, they called them pools, but they were cartels, to set rates and to allocate traffic to different carriers.
At the time, these cartels were perfectly legal, but there was no way of enforcing their agreements.
There was nothing really to prevent one railroad from cheating, undermining the cartel, so the cartel collapsed and they'd have to try it all over again.
But with the Farmers' Alliance's calls for federal involvement in rail transport, a new solution came into view.
The railroads perceived an opportunity to have the federal government manage and enforce their cartel for them. And so railroad executives were, in fact, I wouldn't say overwhelming supporters, but they were receptive to the idea of federal regulation.
As we've mentioned before, the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 created the Interstate Commerce Commission, or the ICC, in order to regulate the railroads.
It is a mechanism to establish, as it says, rates that are reasonable and just.
The Act designated railroads as common carriers with an obligation to serve every shipper along their lines at a standard public rate.
It's like, okay, you can have a privately owned railroad and you can make money on this railroad, but you're not allowed to discriminate against people based on price or on terms of service. We will charge different amounts for different products, but whatever the price was, everybody pays the same price per mile. If you move a ham, it costs this, no matter who you are, where you're going.
In spirit, the Interstate Commerce Act championed a standard of economic equity that, as Phil pointed out, was closely aligned with America's founding vision. But again, railroad customers made up only one of the major constituencies shaping the Interstate Commerce Act and its implementation. The other was the railroads themselves.
And the intent of the railroads was to ensure that they could manipulate the regulatory process to best suit their interests. And they shaped the debate over what is often called the Interstate Commerce Act. And it's very clear that the ICC, for the first approximately 20 years of its existence, is either weak and ineffectual or else asking the railroads what they should do to regulate the railroads.
As we've heard, the railroads viewed federal regulation as a way of enforcing the rate-making pools or cartels that they had already formed to protect themselves against ruinous competition. After the Interstate Commerce Act, railroads were sorted geographically into organizations called rate bureaus, which functioned in the same way as the cartels that preceded them. The only difference for the first several years was that the ICC could investigate whether a given rate was reasonable and just. The commission had zero power to reject rates and no authority to set minimum or maximum limits on them. But as the progressive movement of the late 19th and early 20th century picked up steam, a sea change began to occur. Its first signs came in 1903. President Theodore Roosevelt ordered his Justice Department to sue to block J.P. Morgan and James J. Hill from merging their railroads into what would have been the largest company in the world. The Supreme Court sided with the Roosevelt administration, finding that the merger violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. 3 years later,
Congress passes the Hepburn Act, which may well have been the most destructive, or certainly at least the most consequential piece of federal legislation affecting the railroads. It strengthened the authority of the Interstate Commerce Commission over rates. And what may have been the most severe consequence was it imposed a standardized accounting framework on the railroads. The accounting standards were at variance with those used in manufacturing enterprises in the sense that they artificially disguised, not inflated, but disguised the potential profitability of the railroads. And so they discourage rather than encourage the allocation of investment capital into railroad securities. They made railroads a less attractive investment. And you can see the switch beginning to occur right about 1906 and the decades that followed, as railroads argued, and this was correct, that they needed to maintain their rates, they needed to maintain rate flexibility, and they needed to attract massive amounts of investment capital because railroads were so incredibly expensive to build.
the Hepburn Act put railroads in a vulnerable position, and it only took a year for that vulnerability to turn into a downward spiral that would have unprecedented consequences.
In 1907, there's a short but severe financial panic that, among other things, leads to the creation of the Federal Reserve System and the beginning of monetary policy. So it's a small but very significant hiccup in the financial system. And this hit the railroads hard. You can see all across the country that railroads began to pull back on their capital investments, which is a problem because this continues into the early 19-teens when the political situation in Europe deteriorates. August 1914, World War I begins, and American industrial production increases because the Europeans are ordering weaponry from us. And the railroads are struggling to accommodate all this level of traffic and so forth. They had been kind of unprepared for this. They hadn't been able to keep with the little capital investments and so on. And railroad executives said, "We told you so. We warned you what would happen." And that fell on deaf ears. What people saw was, particularly as it became clear the United States was going to be drawn in, which it was in April of 1917, that the situation on the railroads was affecting military preparedness. They say this is a railroad problem. Management is not managing these railroads properly, and coupled with very severe winter weather, which just snarls things up completely, that leads to political support for a government takeover of the railroads.
In December of 1917, the federal government created the United States Railroad Administration, or the USRA, which took control of the entire railroad industry. And although ownership of the railroads technically remained private for the duration of the war, the long-term future of the industry was anyone's guess.
Many people saw this as an experiment and potentially a prelude to permanent government management or even outright nationalization, government ownership of the railroad network. There were some people, like labor attorney Glenn Plum, who came up with a plan called the Plum Plan that would have permanently nationalized the railroads. Right? And there was similar sentiment in Great Britain and elsewhere about that.
The Plum Plan, which we will return to in a future episode, was supported by over 99% of railroad workers in a referendum that tallied more than 300,000 votes. But there were other, stronger factors at play.
This is a period of intense political flux in the United States. There is a Democratic administration that is kind of an aberration following two Republican administrations. That shifts, of course, to Republican control in the 1920s. There are massive transformations in Europe. Obviously, the Soviet Union is established. And there is the Red Scare in the United States, fears of what people call Bolshevism, Bolshevization of the United States. And it's in that context that there just isn't any political support for anything even resembling government control and certainly not government ownership of property. because that's seen as a preliminary step to Bolshevism.
So public ownership of the railroads was taken off the table, at least temporarily, and the railroads were returned to private control. But Congress knew that something still had to be done to ensure the viability of the railroad system. Public control of the railroads during the war had demonstrated the benefits of greater integration and coordination within the system, and the railroad network had remained overbuilt since the days of ruinous competition. So Congress turned to the idea of planned consolidation.
The 1920 Transportation Act instructed the ICC to develop a plan to group the nation's railroads into self-sustaining systems of roughly equal profitability. So the ICC is given this congressional mandate to develop a consolidation plan, and they hire probably the leading transportation economist in the United States, William Z. Ripley from Harvard. He sets to work trying to allocate the nation's railroads into various systems. And he comes up with some plans and everything, but it quickly kind of spirals out of control because Congress has given the ICC a mandate to develop a consolidation plan, but not the legal authority to mandate or enforce it. So all the ICC can do is A, encourage the railroads to comply, and B, the ICC can disallow mergers and acquisitions that are not in conformity with the system plan. What happens is railroads begin jockeying for position. They all do it, but the executives on the powerful railroads look at the situation, they say, one of two things is going to happen. Either the ICC is going to recommend strengthening competing railroads at our expense, or they're going to eviscerate us to kind of make things equal and fair. And so to defend ourselves, we're not going to merge, because you can't necessarily do that without ICC approval, but we're going to acquire substantial, even controlling interests in railroads that might be in play in the consolidation game. And so they spend lavishly, and it really consumes the talents of the executives during the 1920s at a time when they and the ICC should be focused on what is a more severe threat, and that is not one railroad against another railroad, but rather the entire railroad industry against motor carriers.
That is to say, cars, but especially trucks, both of which operated over infrastructure built and maintained by the public. The first wave of trucking and automobile growth took railroads completely by surprise.
In the early 20th century, railroad executives were active supporters of the good roads movement. They wanted all-weather highways because they perceived roads as a mechanism for farmers to go like the last mile from railroad tracks to their farm, to their store, whatever. They never really seemed to visualize the possibility that motor truck technology and highway construction techniques would improve so quickly that by the 1920s, it wasn't a matter of the last mile, it was every mile of the journey. And the railroads were kind of slow to pick up on that, and so was the ICC. Because, of course, the ICC until 1935 had no authority to regulate the motor carrier industry at all.
We'll come back to that competition in a minute, but for now, it's important to understand that the ICC's consolidation plan never came to fruition.
All these consolidation plans are in play. The railroads are engaging in these Byzantine maneuverings to outrun the various consolidation plans. They're getting involved in the discussion about what the plan should be. There are several iterations of the plan. They come out in 1928, 29. The ICC is divided about whether these plans are viable. And then, of course, the Great Depression happens. And that's it. I mean, nobody cares at this point about planning. It's in really survival mode. And so that is the end of the official efforts by the ICC to group the railroads into self-sustaining systems. Though it's not until 1940 that the Transportation Act of 1940 finally exempts the ICC from the planning mandate.
Between Progressive Era regulations, the Great Depression, and the rise of interstate trucking, the first few decades of the 20th century were not easy for the railroads. Many of them went bankrupt. But it's worth considering that even after the Depression, the industry as a whole was still kicking, and so the public still had access to rail service that it could rely upon.
Really, through much of the early 20th century, the ICC did a pretty fair job of maintaining equitable rail service. They'd come to a kind of, whether it's a truce, a consensus, an understanding with the railroad industry, they created a stable cartel.
Decades later, when part of the industry found itself in dire straits yet again, the system of rate bureaus that Professor Chiarella is referring to here would come under fire as anti-competitive, with critics arguing that collusion between the railroads was keeping rates artificially high. But according to Professor Chiarella, that's not how people were thinking about it at the time.
If you go back to the original language of the 1887 law that established the ICC, right? The ICC was very much committed to equity. What would get a railroad into trouble more quickly than anything else when it came to filing rates is if that rate disrupted established patterns of commerce, or if the rate placed one group of people, one class of shippers, or one set of communities at a comparative disadvantage relative to another group of people, class of shippers, or group of communities. So in other words, the ICC did what Congress wanted to do and said, look, it is fundamentally unfair that you as a traveler or as a business executive or whatever, manufacturer, just because you're located in Poughkeepsie and not Pittsburgh, you should suffer because of that. Your rights as a resident of Poughkeepsie to mobility are every bit as important as the rights of a person living in Pittsburgh. What that did mean was that you probably enjoyed an economic advantage that in a free market system, whatever that means, you probably would not have had, because bad on you for living in Poughkeepsie when Pittsburgh is clearly a bigger city and much better served by rail transportation. The counter argument to that was, what's the alternative? Okay, we'll disband the ICC, we'll rigorously prohibit any collusion among railroad executives, throw people in jail if we need to keep them from setting prices. What do we have then? Well, we have cutthroat competition, declining profits, companies going bankrupt, suspending service, unable to attract investment capital, thousands, tens of thousands of workers thrown out of their jobs, transportation network paralyzed, substandard physical plant because of inadequate investment, train wrecks. Is that what we want? Is that the price we pay for the ability for some people to have lower rates? So that, I think, is the argument that people would have used. And they would have said, okay, here's the thing. The system we have works. And thanks to steady improvements in railroad transportation technology and operations, rates are, generally speaking, declining in constant dollar terms. And, key point, they are steadily declining as a percentage of the final cost of manufactured goods. That is, if you consider the expense of transportation to be a problem, it's becoming less of a problem every year. So, yeah, we could mess with the system and we could create the potential for chaos. But what do we really gain from all this? What's the benefit here? Because everybody seems to be getting better off. And statistically, everybody was actually getting better off.
This system was in place during the Great American Takeoff, the industrial takeoff that created the world's largest middle class, the incredible industrial base that won World War II, all that. This is the regulatory regime under which America became great as an industrial power. Sorry, it doesn't fit a lot of people's ideas of how we became great, but that is it. We had this explicit industrial policy run by the Interstate Commerce Commission that basically controlled the price of everything made and shipped in the United States.
And according to Professor Chiarella, it is possible that this system could have continued to work.
In theory, that system could have carried forward indefinitely, even at the present day, had the ICC had full authority to regulate all forms of transportation, including personal automobiles, which are very difficult to regulate, right? Yet they constitute the majority by far of transportation miles. So had the ICC had full authority to regulate every conceivable mode of transportation on a basis of equity, that system might have worked and might still work.
The problem is the ICC did not have this authority.
The regulatory regime of the ICC was always predicated on either protecting the public from the railroads or protecting the railroads from each other. it was never set up to protect the railroads and other forms of competition.
In fact, as competition from trucks really began to heat up in the mid-20th century, Congress actively prevented the ICC from coordinating rail rates or investments to manage competition between trucks and trains.
1940, the Transportation Act 1940, specifically instructed the ICC that they could not use taxpayer subsidies for building and maintaining highways as a factor to determine rate increases. In other words, if a railroad said, we got to pay for our own infrastructure ourselves, and the federal government or the state of New York just dumped $80 million to build the New York Thruway, doesn't that mean we get something in return? The answer is no, not according to Congress, you don't.
8 years later, railroad infrastructure was worn down by World War II. Trucks were continuing to gain ground, and it seemed like things couldn't get much worse for the railroads. And then, all of a sudden, the Department of Justice begins to turn its sights on the cartel-like rate bureau structure that had effectively stabilized the railroad industry for decades. This, in effect, was what the Justice Department said.
Look, we've evaluated these rate bureaus, and, we're kind of familiar with antitrust issues, and by God, if this isn't a trust, I don't know what is. We're going to go after these.
The railroads and the ICC were outraged.
They said, look, you break up the rate bureaus, the whole rate-making system collapses, the railroad industry collapses, we're done here.
And Congress saw that this wasn't a bluff.
Congress basically did an end run around the Justice Department, said, okay, it's not actually a trust, right? We're going to call it something else.
Congress passed the Reed-Bullwinkle Act in 1948, exempting the railroads' rate bureaus from antitrust laws. This allowed the railroads to continue raising their rates to keep up with their costs, which they definitely needed to do.
During World War II, and in the years that followed, railroad labor unions became very powerful. They got substantial increases in wages and fringe benefits. They got escalator clauses, cost of living increases, fuel prices went up, raw materials prices went up. And so always the railroads are playing catch up because the only thing they could do is to go to the ICC and ask if it was okay to charge higher rates.
But the ability to cover these costs with rate increases also came with a major downside.
As the railroads were getting higher rates, they were pricing themselves out of the broader market for transportation services compared to, trucks in particular.
So the railroads were already in a precarious situation by the time construction began on the interstate highway system in 1956. And in episode 2, we discussed the pretty drastic impacts this, as well as public investments in aviation and waterways, would have on the railroad's freight and passenger revenues. But according to Professor Chiarella, the final straw for the railroads, in a near-perfect recapitulation of the events of the early 1900s, was an economic downturn known as the Eisenhower Recession.
It really hit in late 1958 and 1959. It was actually not that severe of a recession, but it really hit the railroads hard. And they never recovered from that, never. They did what railroads always do in economic downturns. They cut maintenance, but deferred maintenance eventually catches up with you, right? Because it means reduction in quality of service and so forth. And they enter what is often called a death spiral. So you reduce the frequency of train operations, you reduce maintenance and so forth. The quality of service goes down, which means more and more shippers defect to trucks, which means that you have to further reduce maintenance and service and so on, and just it spirals out of control.
The railroad's death spiral caught almost everyone by surprise.
For a long time, pretty much everybody, journalists, politicians, labor leaders, ICC officials, they said, they're the railroads. The railroads aren't going anywhere. They're invincible, right? I mean, they're the railroads, for heaven's sakes. I mean, for all our lives, they've been central to the American economy. What can happen to the railroads? And then all of a sudden, people realize, oh, this isn't good. The railroads really are in trouble.
In the 1910s, the public had responded to a similar crisis in the railroad industry by taking the reins. Before, a Red Scare took root, ensuring that the railroads were returned to private control. This time, the Red Scare was already there.
This is 1950s. This is what? The Cold War, when everybody is seeing reds under the beds. So that really shapes the political discourse. Nobody is talking about nationalization because that's communism. That's going to turn us into the Ruskies. We're America. If the Russians are 100% communist, we are 100% capitalist. And we are going to be the biggest, best, most capitalist nation there is to prove to the world that capitalism is better than communism. So there's no talk really of nationalization. And so what emerges is a solution that's not a good solution, but it's the least bad solution, and that is merger.
As they say, history doesn't repeat, but it definitely rhymes.
Railroads in the 50s and 60s were faced with substantial overcapacity. There's more track and stuff than they really needed to haul the freight. So they said, look, here's what we're going to do. We are going to merge companies, eliminate duplicate facilities, and, some other stuff, right? And of course, the other stuff often meant laying off employees or closing branch lines and shutting off access to small, but, let's not talk about that, right? And these were parallel mergers, not end to end. These were parallel mergers, which reduced competition, but it was seen as acceptable because, well, what other alternative is there?
In December 1959, the Norfolk and Western Railway merged with its rival, the Virginian Railway. It was the first major merger in response to the Eisenhower recession, and it actually made a lot of sense.
The president of Norfolk and Western, Stuart Saunders, he very carefully laid the groundwork for this with labor, with shippers, with regulators, with politicians, everybody. He got all his ducks in a row, and he offered substantial concessions, which he can do because both the Norfolk and Western and the Virginian were highly profitable companies. And it turns out it's very easy to merge two profitable companies. Merging two failing ones is a bit more difficult. And so it worked. And people say, maybe that's the solution. Let's keep doing this. So there was like this merger mania that characterized the 1960s.
And here's where things started to go awry.
The Transportation Act of 1940 has eliminated the then 20-year-old mandate for the ICC to develop a system plan. Congress in 1940 says, I said, you don't have to do that anymore. And now the way the ICC interpreted that in the 1960s was not just that we don't have to, but that we shouldn't. And so the ICC is confronted with this tidal wave of merger applications because, of course, each merger then triggers a defensive merger by other companies. And if there's ever a time for the ICC to develop, forget about a national transportation plan, they can't do that. But if there's ever a time for the ICC to develop a plan for the railroads, this is it. The ICC says, just can't do it, not in our wheelhouse. All we can do is consider each one of these merger applications as a standalone entity. And in particular, there are three big ones that happen more or less simultaneously. One is the acquisition of the Nickel Plate Road and the Wabash by the Norfolk and Western. The other is, it's not a true merger, it's more of a consolidation short of merger between the Baltimore and Ohio and the Chesapeake and Ohio. And the other, of course, is New York Central, Pennsylvania Railroad, Penn Central.
The Pennsylvania Railroad was known as the standard railroad of the world. Once the world's largest corporation, it was still the largest railroad in the Northeast. And the New York Central, the second largest carrier in the Northeast, was its bitter rival. Their combination to form the Penn Central would be disastrous for competition between railroads in the region. But for the ICC, that was beside the point.
The underlying logic behind all of this, in other words, why are we having these merger proposals in the first place, is not about railroad versus railroad competition. It's about greater efficiencies that will constitute the only viable mechanism for dealing with modal competition from trucks.
Even so, the Penn Central merger announcement should have raised a lot of eyebrows, but in reality, only a handful of people questioned it.
There are a few naysayers, but for the most part, people are like, yeah, this is great, problem solved. Because the proponents of the merger, especially Stuart Saunders, who's the board chair at the Pennsylvania Railroad, said this is going to work. He said $85 million in annual savings. I've written a book on this, and I have no idea where that number came from except thin air. There's no clear indication that that number meant anything, but it sounded good. And more to the point, the ICC believed it. They basically bought hook, line, and sinker the merger proposal. And they said, what could possibly go wrong?
Famous last words.
2 years later, less than 2 years later, biggest bankruptcy in American history. It's maybe difficult for us to really appreciate today the extent to which that sent shockwaves like everywhere, through the railroad industry, through Congress, ranks of labor leaders. People were stunned. I mean, how did this happen?
The first thing on everyone's mind in the aftermath of the Penn Central's collapse was that almost the entire Northeast and a significant portion of the Midwest was about to lose access to rail service that it had relied upon for generations. A federal district judge named John P. Fulham named 4 trustees to oversee the reorganization and continued operation of the railroad. Later that year, Congress would step in with emergency loan guarantees. Now, we have seen already in Episode 3 how Congress responded to the Penn Central's collapse by relieving not only it, but all the railroads of their obligation to carry passengers, a service on which railroads had been losing money for decades. To preserve passenger service, Congress created Amtrak, a government-owned corporation, which began operations in 1971. But this wasn't enough. The Penn Central continued losing money at an astonishing rate, and on March 6, 1973, Judge Fulham declared that the railroad could not be allowed to continue operating beyond October 1st of that year unless someone came up with a plan to fix it. And by this point, other railroads in the region were also beginning to go bankrupt. Once again, Congress had to act fast if it was to preserve freight rail service in the northeastern United States. In the 1950s, the public had chosen mergers over public ownership as a solution to the crisis in the industry. But now, an ill-advised merger had created the mess in which the northeastern rail system found itself. To many, a public takeover seemed like the only option remaining. Even so, that prospect would face an uphill battle.
Understand the context here. This is the early 70s. Massive distrust in the federal government, Vietnam, Nixon's still in office, but Watergate is kind of spiraling out of control, a growing breach between the White House and Congress over any number of issues. There's also some economic problems affecting the economy, and economists are grappling with something that they never knew was a thing that could even exist, right? Economic stagnation coupled with inflation. So there's a growing consensus that the progressive era, New Deal, statist, interventionist regulatory strategy just wasn't effective anymore, that we needed to move to a new paradigm. The notion is that if we let markets function free of intrusive regulation, they will become more efficient, and that will keep costs under control. And so it's the kind of transition from this idea of economic equity or fairness to economic efficiency. And it's that context that underlies the discussion of what do we do, not just with Penn Central, but with 5 other railroads that have gone cascading down into bankruptcy. Congress does, in 73, create the 3R, Regional Rail Reorganization Act, which codifies the concept that the ICC can't handle this. So they create the second USRA, right? This is the United States Railway Association. Aside from its initials, it's got nothing in common with the World War I agency. And the USRA's job is to develop a plan for what to do with Penn Central, obviously, but the other bankrupt carriers.
The 3R Act answered the question of who was going to come up with a solution, but it did not determine what the solution would be, and there was no shortage of opinions.
So, okay, USRA is going to develop the plan. But the USRA is not the only entity in the mix, because the Interstate Commerce Commission is still active, and they've got their own ideas about what the plan should be. The Department of Transportation is also involved. And the DOT, of course, is under the command of first Nixon, then Ford as Republicans. Congress is under Democratic control. So Congress has its own ideas about how this is going to play out. And so there's a, 4-way, 5, I don't know. But anyway, everybody's got their own sense of how this should happen. So generally speaking, what the Nixon and later Ford administration wants is controlled liquidation, which is a fancy way of saying selling off the viable parts of the bankrupt carriers, which preserves 100% private enterprise. It's 100% private enterprise solution. Some people in Congress favor outright nationalization. They say, look, the government's got to own the railroad, not for the good of the people. It's phrased differently. It's in order to preserve the American economy. But it ultimately is for the public interest. The more common, though by no means the dominant sentiment in Congress, is for something that comes to be called CONFAC, which is Consolidated Facilities Corporation, which is government ownership of the infrastructure and maintenance infrastructure, which would then be like leased as almost like a toll road to an operator, which is not unheard of. A lot of European rail services operate on that. So all these ideas in play while the USRA is developing the final system plan. And while the USRA is doing all its work with the preliminary system plan, they are looking and they're looking and they're like, oh my God, we knew it was bad. We never knew how bad it was. This is worse than we had ever possibly imagined. This is the biggest mess we've ever seen. It's going to be more expensive and more difficult to fix than we had ever. I mean, this is beyond the worst case scenario.
The USRA released its final system plan in July of 1975. Initially, they had tried to keep the whole bankrupt rail system in private hands. And when that failed, they tried to maintain some semblance of private sector competition by inviting neighboring railroads to take over parts of the system. But the infrastructure was just too far gone, and nobody wanted it.
Basically, the USRA has walled off all the other options. And the only thing to do is to just glom all the bankrupts together into one big entity that is Conrail. And that goes before Congress, where there are a lot of debates about that. The ICC is not happy. DOT is not happy. The president's administration is not happy. Ford by this time. But the USRA does a very, very good job lobbying Congress, saying there's only one solution here, and Congress approves. They approve the final system plan. They provide the first tranche of funding for Conrail. And this is the 4R Act, the Railroad Revitalization and Regulatory Reform Act of 1976, aka 4R.
From that moment forward, throughout much of the northeastern United States, the Consolidated Railroad Corporation, or Conrail, would be the only freight railroad in operation. With the public's creation of this consolidated monopoly railroad, the merger movement of the 1960s culminated and came to an end, or at least reached an inflection point. And this is not the only change that Conrail ushered in. Though placed under the ownership of the federal government, Conrail, like Amtrak, was given a mandate to make a profit, and the USRA had insisted that it would be impossible to achieve that goal while continuing service on all the tracks it was taking over from the bankrupt railroads.
The USRA said flat out, a substantial portion of the bankrupt's infrastructure should be abandoned. It doesn't carry enough profit to make it economically viable. Some people said as much as a quarter of the bankrupt's rail mileage should be abandoned. Others said it's more like 15%, but the answer is substantial, and clearly some shippers would lose rail access, not because they didn't want it or didn't need it, but because they did not have the economic muscle necessary to make it profitable.
Congress approved the USRA's proposal to abandon thousands of miles of track, and in so doing, it set in motion a reorientation of the purpose of the U.S. rail system that would have consequences that are still reverberating today. For decades, the ICC, at the behest of Congress, had strove to protect the public's access to rail service while ensuring the financial stability of railroad corporations. But massive public investments in competing modes of transportation had brought those two objectives of service and commercial viability into conflict with each other. In a desperate effort to save the railroad corporations, the ICC's ad hoc approach to consolidation had only accelerated their downfall in the Northeast, threatening almost the entire region with a total disappearance of service. Though the public took over responsibility for that service, The profit mandate that Congress imposed had the same effect on Conrail's network that this expectation had had on Amtrak's system just a few years earlier. The pursuit of profit led to a loss of service on lines that were deemed too costly. These abandonments would prove to be a harbinger of things to come in the rest of the industry. And on top of them, Congress also included in the 4R Act further provisions that would loosen the hold of the ICC over not just Conrail, but all the railroads.
In addition to providing money for Conrail and approving the final system plan, Congress mandates the first reduction in regulation, federal regulation of railroads since 1877. They instruct the ICC to make certain concessions as far as the rate structure is concerned, because they begin to realize that the existing regulatory structure is simply not working.
One of the key concessions that Congress introduced was known as a commodity exemption. It allowed the ICC to exempt railroads from their common carrier obligations to move a given commodity whenever the ICC found those obligations to be unnecessary. This amounted to allowing the railroads to charge as little or as much as they liked, or even refuse to provide service at all, so long as the commodity could be moved by truck. Under the 4R Act, the decision of whether to exempt the railroads from their common carrier obligations was left up to ICC discretion, and the ICC used this authority sparingly. Subsequent legislation a few years later would revoke the Commission's discretion in the matter and require it to exempt commodities whenever possible. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Coming back to Conrail, Conrail benefited significantly from the reforms of the 4R Act and had plenty of other things going for it too.
Conrail has a very good leadership team. It attracts people who really are committed to the railroad industry, feel they can make a difference, and think that this is an opportunity, sure, to build their career, but also to create a lasting monument, because they're going to save the railroad industry. So they have a lot of talent. That certainly helps Conrail. They begin to work with the unions for their massive workforce reduction, mainly through attrition. There's also, the funding for Conrail includes buyout money from the federal government, millions of dollars, to basically compensate employees who've lost their jobs. And unions are making concessions because they are realizing how serious this is. That if Conrail fails, that's probably the end of organized labor in the railroad industry. And money's coming in, Conrail rehabilitates the physical plant and so on, but it's not enough. And there are various studies that are done, and they're saying the same thing, that Conrail keeps making unrealistic projections about future business, traffic levels, and so on.
Even with everything going its way, Conrail was unable to turn a profit. At the start of its third year, it was losing $1 million a day, the same rate of loss as the Penn Central. In 1977, Jimmy Carter took over the Oval Office from Gerald Ford, and what he found in Conrail's performance made him furious.
Carter is sending a letter to Ed Jordan at Conrail, and he's basically saying, what the hell are you doing here? You said you were going to spend this much money and have this much business. You're spending more and earning less. And every time you have a problem, you come running back to Congress and say, give us another 20, 30, 50, whatever $1 million. And I'm sick of it. This is an open-ended commitment. You've got to clean up your act. He's not happy about this, and he's not the only one. There's now a growing realization that the plan to get Conrail out of this mess is not working. There's got to be a better solution than just keeping throwing money at the problem. And again, this is in the context where people like Alfred Kahn are coming and sitting down with President Carter and emphasizing the economic benefits of deregulation. And people in the Carter administration are explicitly linking railroad deregulation to airline deregulation, and basically saying, if we can do it for airlines and it seems to be working, why can't we do it for railroads? And by the way, this may be the only way to save Conrail.
By the late 1970s, even Conrail's own leadership was beginning to see that something needed to change.
Conrail executives are lobbying for deregulation big time. They know that if they keep going back to Congress and asking for more money and producing pretty lackluster results, they're out of a job, right? And Conrail could be nationalized. I mean, who knows what the outcome could be. So it's partly self-preservation. It's partly that they're relatively young, outside-the-box thinkers. They're not committed to the status quo. And that brings them into conflict with a lot of their counterparts at other railroads who are like, we got a nice life here. Things are going okay. Why rock the boat? Who knows what can happen, right? Better the devil you know than the devil you don't. Been doing this for 40 years. Why change now? And so Conrail is lobbying heavily for deregulation. And they're trying their best to take advantage of the limited rate liberalization policies associated with the 4R Act, which is different than a lot of other railroads. They were primed to exploit selective rate cutting, to make contracts, to aggressively pursue business, to go after volume, bulk business, that kind of thing. All those things that a marketing department could and should do. And they were chafing at the restrictions imposed by the ICC and saying, too, there's no other way out of this. We've got to change the whole paradigm here if we're going to survive in our current form.
And that's exactly what happened. On October 14th, 1980, President Carter signed the Staggers Act into law, and thus culminated a decade of interventions aimed at rescuing the railroad industry by reorienting its fundamental purpose. For almost a century, the ICC had been instructed by Congress to prioritize the public's access to rail service. But that objective had become increasingly difficult for railroads to meet as the public ramped up its funding for competing modes of transportation. With the Staggers Act, Congress did an about-face. Instead of service coming first, the emphasis would now be placed on the railroad's ability to efficiently allocate their resources to minimize costs and maximize profit. The effect this had on the rail system of the United States was immense. Just as Conrail had done a few years earlier, the Staggers Act allowed railroads to abandon tens of thousands of miles of track, not necessarily because they were unprofitable, but in many cases simply because they were not profitable enough to satisfy shareholders. Though some lines were picked up by a new type of smaller railroad called a short line, many of those short lines were shackled by restrictive contracts which artificially limited their business opportunities and thus their ability to maintain their infrastructure to an operational level or offer their customers a competitive rate. In an effort to drive down rates for those shippers who did retain service, railroad rate bureaus were outlawed, and for many commodities, railroads were given free rein to set their rates however they saw fit. This worked for a few decades, but the Staggers Act also made railroad mergers even more easy than they had been in the 60s, and the industry contracted from nearly 40 Class I freight railroads in 1979 to just 7 in 2000. As a result, railroads gained almost absolute market power over many of their shippers, and this, combined with their newfound pricing freedom, enabled the railroads and Wall Street to complete the reorientation of the railroad industry that the Staggers Act had inaugurated.
2004, you start to see a change in the approach of the railroads from a growth mindset to a profitability one.
Things really went downhill as they became more and more monopolized. That helped embolden railroad management to just realize we don't have to treat our customers very well anymore.
The arrival of activist investors from Wall Street over the past 20 years has resulted in destructive cost-cutting paired with monopolistic price gouging, depriving shippers of access to service that meets their transportation needs or that they can even afford. Driven away by the railroads, customers whose products can be moved by truck have made the costly switch. And this has resulted in roughly 1 trillion ton-miles of long-haul freight over 500 miles moving on trucks, which, as mentioned before, has disastrous implications for the public.
The wear and tear of trucks on the nation's infrastructure and the sheer cost of that is insane. Freight transportation policy should be rail first, truck second.
They continue to make more money on lower volumes. Do we get better rates? Because you've saved so much money on your operations and now you've maintained everything to the lowest level, but we don't. We're always getting rate increases.
It's literally our way or the highway. They pretty much have to stay with us. And if they're capable of switching to the highway, let them.
After years of cutting to the bone and driving away customers to inflate dividends and do stock buybacks, some shareholders are beginning to have concerns about the industry's long-term prospects for growth. From Wall Street to Main Street to the halls of Congress, there is widespread recognition of a need for change. But what that change looks like is a question that once again will pit Wall Street's insatiable appetite for profit against the public's need for service.
There's lots of things that the rail industry could do to bring back more traffic. There's a problem though. All of that costs money. Wall Street doesn't want that. So what's the solution? Merge.
You don't need a merger to compete with trucking. Railroads do not compete with trucking. And if they merge, they would still not compete with trucking.
How does it enhance competition if you're eliminating one entire railroad?
If this merger is allowed, 47% of the freight will be controlled by one railroad, the only transcontinental route by one railroad.
All of which raises questions about the role of rail transport in our society and our economy and its potential to reconnect us all.
People were almost glad to have something that they could come together and vote on that didn't cause them to have protesters on their front lawn when they went home at night.
Both sides do share a vision of wanting a reindustrialization, and you can't get reindustrialization without fixing the railroad problem.
It's akin, I think, to a revolution, not an evolution, and it's not something that CSX or others are really doing.
That's for next time on Reconnect America. Reconnect America is a podcast by Solutionary Rail. This episode was written by Sasha Lenko and me, Bill Moyer. Audio engineering and production by Tom Stiles and August Moore. Occasional percussion by yours truly, and background music by my old bandmates in Oda Proda. Special thanks to Ken Jacobson for our theme music. You can find this show on Substack, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your pods. You may have noticed that this podcast doesn't have ads or a paywall. With your help, we can keep it that way. Pitch in and get involved by visiting solutionaryrail.org. We're not here to sell you anything. We are here to build a movement.